So yeah, so I did the flyby last night, and obviously you can get some context as to what all of that was about through the slides above in the blog post. And but really, the main kind of part of this was I wanted to show how you could make really sexy, like good-looking, high-fidelity prototypes quickly and easily with Framer.js, and that becomes huge for usability testing when you want to be able to run a test with a user in an actual like kind of simulation environment. And I guess what I mean by that is like not having them click through some prototype in a web browser. Like with Framer, what's amazing is you can get it to look refined enough and actually access it on your mobile phone, so that you can hand them a phone and they're basically using your prototype almost as if you would have built the test prototype in Objective-C or Swift instead. So it's really powerful, and I've been loving it so far. So I'm gonna go ahead and just first bring you through some of the main kind of interactions and animations you can do to show you kind of like what kind of functionality it has. And then I'm going to show how it integrates with other design software. And I think what makes Framer super powerful is when you can start manipulating your design files and accessing the layers within your design files, and start animating those. Then you can make really, really high quality prototypes that are perfect for usability. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is create a layer. So let's just call it layer A equals new layer, right? And then, so for me, I kind of think of this as like a JavaScript object, and you're just adding properties. And the actual syntax that we're using right now is CoffeeScript, which I believe is just a compiled version of JavaScript. So here we're setting properties. I set a background color. Let's set the width to 400, height 400, oops. And then let's give it a border radius of like 60. And just to make this a little prettier, let's use the method center. So just we can see what's happening. Okay, so now let's look to add some interactivity to this layer. What's great about Framer is that you can get these animations that look very professional for very cheap and do it very quickly. So similarly to JavaScript, you've got event listeners, and so we're going to add an event listener that's essentially just a click event. And so you have to do events.click, and then here's the syntax for the event listening, or the functions. Is this, which is kind of weird. And then once you click, we want to animate the layer. So what we do is layer A animate, and up next you assign the properties for that animation. So we want it to rotate, let's say 360 degrees, and scale down to 60%. Lastly, you assign the type of animation, and there's a lot of different options. We're going to use ease in and out here, and this is kind of just uses a little bit of acceleration. You can do linear, which is pretty straightforward. It just goes to A to B in a constant speed. You can do spring, which has a bit of bounce. You can refer to all of this stuff in the documentation, and it's pretty helpful. But let's give this a shot. So you click, right? So I clicked, and you had your nice little animation. What if you wanted to thread animations, like have animations sequentially trigger as each one finishes? So let's look at threading animation. So we got our first animation here, and now let's create another event listener which checks when the animation has ended. So what we're going to do is say layer A dot on events dot animation end, and then again we want to animate once that happens. Properties. Let's say we want to shoot the shape off of the screen to the left. So let's reassign the X position to -500 from where it is currently. Let's rotate it back 360 degrees from what it was before. And you can do something which is pretty handy is you can control the time it takes to perform the animation. So I didn't do it before, but you can easily set how long the animation takes by saying time. And let's then again just use the same ease in, out. Sweet, so in theory this should work. So I'm clicking, I'm just going to reload to make sure. Clicking does one animation, and excuse me, and then it fires the other one. Sweet. The last thing I'll do in this kind of super brief intro to like animation and states, and kind of layers, I guess, is states. So sometimes it might not work for your experience that you are just having these animations sequentially fire. What if you want these kind of attributes to change with user input, like every time a person clicked on the layer? So let's go ahead and use the states kind of functionality, which is super helpful. So in order to add states to your layer, you just say layer.a states, states add. And then you can basically assign any number of states. So let's just make it 4. So the first one is obviously the initial state, which it is currently. And so the second one, let's just move the Y positioning up to 40. Third, let's rotate it 180 degrees. And then let's also scale it down to 30%. And again, I'm using scale and rotation a lot because I feel like it just demonstrates the animation clearly, but there's a lot of different properties that you can mess with. And then for the last one, let's change the Y position to 600 and scale it back up to like 130. Cool, so we've added states, and now we want to basically tell Framer what kind of animation we want to happen between these states. So we do layer A states animation options equals, and here let's assign a curve with a, let's do a spring this time. So I think you can put in parameters here to dictate the type of spring animation. I'm not going to get into what those mean because that's a bit trickier, but you can Google it. It's easy to find out. So now we want these states to change based on the click event. So let's say layer A, got the on events dot click syntax. And now we just want to say layer A dot states dot next. No, we want next like this. Perfect. Okay, so now we should be able to toggle through the states. So if I click on this guy, it goes to the second state, which moves it up to the Y 40 position. If you click again, it goes to the third one where it rotates 180 and scales to 30%. Click again, well, it just kind of went crazy because I think I put scale 130 instead of 1.3. Let's try that again. Up, down, there we go. And on the third one, you get the Y600 position, and it scales to 130%. And the cool thing about states is that you can continually toggle through. So that's kind of a demo, basic demo of like the kinds of interactions you can do. But now I want to show you where Framer gets really powerful is when you can start manipulating your design files like this. So let me bring up a new file actually. Cool. And let's start out by talking about Sketch. So Sketch is a design software similar to Photoshop. It's like layer based. And I also, it's pretty crazy. Like where I was working this summer, almost everyone was using Sketch now and not Photoshop or Illustrator in the UX field, obviously. And I can still see a lot of merits for visual design when you're doing Photoshop and Illustrator. Um, this isn't great for like doing custom vectors, but when you're talking about building, page compositions, it's pretty fantastic. Um, it's lightweight, so you don't get the kind of the lag that you get when you're working with really large Photoshop files. And also, it's got this great, integration with Framer, which almost makes it worthwhile in itself. So when you're building a Framer file, you should consider if you're planning on, if you're building a sketch file and you intend to import it to Framer, there's a couple things you should just consider. Like if you plan on layering things on top of each other and you know that in advance, it makes it a bit easier when you just separate it out into its own separate artboard. So here you can see nav. I plan on superimposing that on top of all the pages. So I've separated it out as its own artboard, as you can see here. And then there's color 1, color 2, and color 3, which will be our 3 pages. And two other important things to know about the integration with Framer and Sketch. If you want to be able to manipulate a layer within Framer, a sketch layer within Framer, it needs to be in a folder. The layer can't just be like by itself. And secondly, if you're working with Retina devices, make sure you use the 2x or 3x or whatever the Retina resolution is. So that's why I'm at 750 width for the iPhone 6, and the height would be 1334, but we're going to have a scrolling component, so the height is kind of irrelevant. So we've got our file, and we want to import our sketch file. Super easy. You just click on that import button. You see your sketch file name there. It's going to choose the sketch file that was last active in the Sketch program. So it needs to be open, and you need to have that window selected before you go to Sketch. So you import it. And the first thing you're going to want to do is just change this kind of object that's going to contain all your sketch files to an easier name. I just use design because it's a bit easier. And then hold on one sec. And then the next thing you want to do is Sketch or Framer doesn't make all your sketch artboards visible by default. You have to go ahead and do that. It sometimes makes the first one or second one visible automatically, but I just make it a habit to just make all your artboards visible at first. Make artboards visible. And then if you don't want the page to display, you can always set opacity to 0. So let's do design.nav.visible equals true. And all of a sudden you see that nav that appears. You get both that page that was visible and the nav are kind of offset. Sometimes Framer does that, it's weird, but you can override it really easily, so I'll show you that. And you can see that the design.nav, so design is the sketch object, and I'm referencing the nav, whatever is named nav in Sketch. It happens to be the artboard itself, so it's going to apply to the entire artboard. But you could just say design.colorblock, and it's going to apply to that specific layer within the artboard. So you can really kind of single out any grouped layer, so anything that's in a folder from Sketch. So that's pretty awesome. So let's just go ahead and do this quickly for the other artboards. So it's color 1, color 2, color 3. So now we've got all our artboards visible, and let's just get the positioning correct because it's kind of annoying me. So let's just set some default properties. So let's say design.nav.x equals 0. So here you can see that you can start actually getting into the properties of each layer. So the nav went from being off to the side to now centered perfectly. And we're going to do that for all of them, similar to what we just did before. Color 1, color 2, 3. Cool, we have our defaults now. And we've got this kind of static frame of the nav and this page. And we want to add a scrolling functionality. So in order to do that, it's pretty easy. Framer has things called scroll components. So we're going to use one of those, and we're going to name it color1 scroll. And you say equals new scroll component. And you can set a variety of properties. You can set a name, which we don't really need for this, but we'll do it anyway. Color1, you can do width and screen width. So basically, kind of similarly to other environments we've dealt with, you can just use the kind of full width and full height of the screen. So screen.height. And this is going to be a vertical scroll component. You can make horizontal scroll components, but we want to make sure it doesn't scroll horizontally. So we're going to say scroll horizontal false. And a good thing to always have on, unless you actually want diagonal scrolling, is direction lock. So that means you can't scroll on 2 axes at once. Here's the important part. So you have this scroll component, but you can see it's blue. This thing right here, and it's blue because it's empty, and that's kind of the default state for any component or layer that you start in Sketch without really assigning it many properties. What we want to do now is actually put the design.color1 artboard into the scroll component, and you can do that by setting the design.color1 kind of page. There's a thing called super layer, and you set its super layer to the scroll component, and that basically just means that the scroll component will be its container. So you say design.color1.superlayer equals, and then the syntax for this is just color1. You put the scroll component, and then you just have to say content. And now what you see, all of a sudden, the 2 things have happened. You no longer see the nav, and the reason for that is because the scroll component has kind of messed up the initial hierarchy. It's like now a new thing in itself. But now you can see that you can scroll. I'm scrolling that page of content that I created within the scroll component. It's awesome. You know, this is particularly great for presenting to clients or colleagues. And instead of having to export stills of your Photoshop designs where you have to like periodically drag through the designs to kind of simulate scrolling, which takes forever, you can now do this in a second, which is awesome. But let's say we want to just make sure that really quickly that the nav appears above the scroll component. Now that the default kind of didn't take care of that for us. And in order to do that, you have to use index. It's kind of similar to z-index in CSS. And so let's just mark this as hierarchy. That's how you spell it. And design.nav.index equals, let's give it 3. And then let's give what we're going to do here is instead of referencing the design.color1 artboard, because it's now in the container color1 scroll, we're going to reference color1 scroll, because that's what's going to be able to let us control the hierarchy. And so right now, the effect that happened was, unfortunately, the other 2 pages we made visible kind of interfered with the page that we actually set an index for. But now that I made the other 2 pages not visible, you can see that we have this nice scroll component and the nav above like we wanted. One last thing, one thing that would annoy me is potentially the fact that we've got this block that's being kind of cut off by the nav. And you can adjust that by adding padding, and I think all you have to do is say content inset, and you say top, 130? Yeah, okay. So now this looks really good to me. You could show this page and really bring your stakeholder through a very realistic, interpretation of what your product will be. So let's go ahead and start adding the other pages in. And what we want is to ultimately create pages that scroll vertically, but you can swipe horizontally to toggle through the pages. So we've got, to do this quickly, let's just copy and paste this. And if you're doing this, make sure you very clearly change the names here. So color 2 scroll, we're going to put the color 2 artboard in the color 2 scroll component. Same here. And we want to give them the same index, and you'll see what's going to happen in a second. Index. Just so it still looks nice, let's just give this an index of 2 so it comes on top. And now we've got all our scroll components, and let's go ahead and create a page component, which is what's going to let us swipe through these pages. It's really great, and you can even do vertical page components. I'm not going to get into that. It's just as easy. There's a variety of use cases for that, so you can do horizontal or vertical pretty much. And to create the page component, let's give it a name. So pages, new page component. Oops. And you want to give it a width, screen.width. So now we're doing screen.width on these things, but you can just as easily, make a page component much smaller within the screen. And then, because we don't want it to scroll, or the page component to be vertical, you basically just tell it to say scroll vertical false. And again, we're going to put in direction lock because that's always a good safety to have true. So we have our page component that we've created. I don't know why it's saying can't find direction lock. That's weird. Oh, it's because I'm not putting the colon there. So cool. You see again now you've got this like kind of empty object or container, which is the page component. And we want to add pages to this. So, but before we do that, well, actually, we can just do that right now. So, in order to add pages to your page component, you're going to say pages dot add page, and then you tell it exactly what you're adding and where you're going to add it. So, we're actually going to add the entire scroll component so that the pages are scrollable, and we're going to say to put it to the right. So right now we've added a page to the page component. So you can see now that the first page is kind of swipeable and still scrollable. So so we're going to do that with the other pages as well. Say color 2 and color 3. Oh, that'll explain it. So now we're good. For some reason, so we've got, well here, let's make sure now that we've put these guys, so all of these scroll components in a page component, the hierarchy that we set on the scroll components is no longer relevant because it's going to be dictated by the page component. So let's just say pages dot index equals let's say 1. So now you can be sure that your scroll component or your page component, and scrolling will still make sure that the nav is above it. And if you noticed here, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why. Again, sometimes it's buggy. The content within this scroll component looks like, because if I hover over color 3, the scroll content itself is up, but the scroll component, or the design.color3 artboard, is starting at Y293, which is weird. So let's just go ahead and go to our defaults and see if this fixes it. Design.color3.y equals 0. So in theory now, there we go. So that's pretty much the full demo. It's pretty rad. I feel like you can really build some fun stuff with this. And the last thing I'll say is there's a bunch of really handy features here. You can share it, which will actually give you a URL that you could access on a web page, and it'll look exactly like this, which is pretty rad. And then the other thing is, if you're doing that and you want to use a mobile device, download an app called Frameless and just go to the URL, and it's going to basically hide the URL browser thingy so that it looks like a native app. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully this was helpful, and feel free to ask any questions. All right.